Hello and welcome to day 2 of the Greenlight Guru True Quality Summit, the 3-day event designed to provide actionable takeaways you can implement in your own company to innovate faster, stay ahead of regulatory changes, and use quality as a strategic asset to grow your device business. This session is on understanding post-market surveillance under EU MDR, being proactive, not reactive. I'm Jessica Lyons, Senior Medical Device Guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We've got a really special session scheduled for you today. I know our speaker, Carolyn Guthrie, is really looking forward to sharing why it is important that PMS is not a one-size-fits-all approach, with considerations for risk of the device, lifetime of device, time of the market, and more. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our speaker and her company, Kapstone Medical, I'm going to touch on a few items really quickly. First, this session is going to run for about 45 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Carolyn will be kind enough to answer your questions. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation as they come up in the box on the right-hand side. We will get to as many of them as time permits. Any additional questions that we're unable to answer, Carolyn will follow up with you all. This entire session will be recorded as well. Once this session wraps up, there's a 10-minute break before the next live session begins. If you're interested in learning about post-market surveillance, if a device is FDA cleared or approved or EU CE marked, is that device safe and effective? You'll want to be sure you're registered for the next session and use your unique link to tune in. If you aren't already signed up, you can register for the next session and over 20 others at virtual-summit.greenlight.guru. I'd also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on this free virtual summit. If you've been on one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. Likely a similar mission as many of you at today's summit. Anything we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting free events and training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultants, or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies from across the globe are moving away from paper-based general-purpose quality management systems and adopting our purpose-built medical device quality management software, I encourage you to head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. Now, on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to your presenter today, Carolyn Guthrie. Carolyn is the Director of QARA at Kapstone Medical, a full-service medical device consultancy that provides expertise for pre- and post-market medical devices in the US and EU. She has 15 years of experience in quality assurance and regulatory affairs in the medical device industry. She has worked for and with both large corporations and startup companies with a single employee. The types of devices she has worked with varied from in vitro diagnostic devices to orthopedic and dental implants, and from software products to packaging and sterilization solutions. Carolyn has experience globally with a focus on North America and Europe in both the pre-market and post-market quality and regulatory functions, including pre-market submissions, 510(k) and CE mark, as well as day-to-day operations and quality assurance and quality systems. So without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenter, Carolyn.
Thanks, Jessica, and welcome to everybody who has joined us live for this, and actually for the recordings as well. When you do watch, well, welcome. Just to tell you a little bit more about Capstone itself. So Capstone is a full-service solution provider that aims to inspire, guide, and equip our medical device-focused customers in 4 primary service areas. Those are quality assurance, regulatory, new product development, and manufacturing solutions. Our quality support includes implementing or upgrading quality management systems to the latest FDA and ISO requirements. And then we also offer assistance to companies big and small in the American and European markets, as well as others across the globe. As you can tell, I'm from South Africa. Well, my accent is South African, so we really are across the globe. Our regulatory track record totals decades of experience and dozens of successful submissions spanning multiple sub-industries in the medical device field. So I just wanted to give an introduction with my camera on. While I give the webinar, I'm actually going to switch it off, and then I'll come back on for the question, the Q&A session at the end. So give me 1 second while I switch this off. On. Did not check that beforehand. Okay, so forgive me again if I'm looking down during the thing. I just have a few notes that I want to refer to. So getting started. So today's webinar, we're going to be discussing post-market surveillance, specifically pertaining to the new requirements under the EU medical device regulations. As this is such a big topic, I'll be providing as concise an understanding as possible of the following topics: the actual PMS requirements, how to integrate into your current QMS, the impact to your business, the relationship between post-market surveillance, risk management, and clinical evaluation, and then an overview of post-market surveillance plans and reports. And also, this is driven by the regulations themselves. Some of my slides are quite word heavy, so I just want to make sure you're seeing the regulations as they're written. So we won't go over the slide in total, but just so you can see the regulations as written. All right. So I think to understand the new requirements, it's really important to understand what the current requirements are. So the requirements for post-market surveillance are not new in the EU, but they're just now, with the new MDR, going to be legally required activities under the MDR with more prescriptive measures. Most manufacturers currently fall short of the current requirements. The new post-market surveillance requirements will go into enforcement on May 2021, but I'm just showing these current requirements to impress upon you that you need to be taking action now. In the past already, but you need to take action now to even consider meeting the 2021 deadline. The directive in Annex 2, which is the full quality assurance system, required a manufacturer to institute and maintain an up-to-date systematic procedure to review experience gained from devices in the post-production phase and implement the appropriate means to apply necessary corrective actions. The various MedDev documents and requirements within the harmonized standards also provided additional guidance on how this was intended to be achieved and demonstrated. Much of the content of these MedDev documents have now been codified into the medical device regulations. So it is anticipated that the guidelines will be followed unless national legislation requires. And I think that's something that many people do not understand at this time. MedDev documents, even though they're guidance documents, it's understood that you will follow them unless told otherwise by a national legislation. So if your organization has been following those MedDev documents, your adoption of these new regulations is going to be somewhat simpler. Furthermore, in the current requirements, also as stated in Annex 2, the notified body must audit the quality system to determine whether it meets the requirements referred to in Section 3.2, which is what we just touched on. It must presume that quality systems which implement the relevant harmonized standards conform to these requirements. So the ISO 13485-2016 is a harmonized standard that will allow you to conform to those requirements. So I'm just going to refer to ISO 13485 to detail some of those, the post-market requirements in there. So ISO 13485-2016, as most of you know, is the harmonized standard used to demonstrate conformance to Annex 2, to some of the requirements of Annex 2. Annex 2, Section 3.2. Section 8.2 of ISO 13485 specifically states, the organization shall document procedures for the feedback process. This feedback process shall include provisions to, get important now in red, gather data from production as well as post-production activities. This information will serve as a potential input into risk management. If applicable, regulatory requirements require the organization to gain specific experience from post-market activities. So I'm just hitting on some of the highlights. You guys will all receive copies of these slides and you can review them in detail if wanted. So during your conversion to 2016, organizations will have been required to implement some of these systems already. All right, so now that we know what current requirements are, let's discuss the new requirements under the EU MDR. This slide shows the framework of the new MDR around post-market activities, including both proactive and reactive elements of post-market surveillance and the associated section in the EU MDR. I won't be going into each of these in detail in this webinar. However, I will demonstrate as much as possible how many of these systems are interrelated. All of the following systems or processes, elements, or whatever you choose to call them as an organization, need to be considered under post-market activity. So post-market activity, risk management, clinical evaluation, etc. Some of these, namely risk management and clinical evaluation, have pre-market activities associated with them, and certain plans are required as part of your technical documentation. So just understanding that this is not, even though called post-market surveillance, some of them have pre-market activities related to them. All right, I think it's important to understand how post-market surveillance has been defined in the the EU MDR, as this drives the further requirements. So in Article 2, Section 60, post-market surveillance is defined as all activities carried out by manufacturers in cooperation with other economic operators. And I know that economic operators were discussed in an earlier webinar, so hopefully you attended that. So in cooperation with other economic operators to institute and keep up to date, this is the important part, a systematic procedure to proactively collect and review experience gained from devices they place on the market. So as highlighted in red, that's the crux of this. The crux of the definition, systematic and proactively. Systematic can be further interpreted to indicate the requirements for integration into a manufacturer's quality management system through development and implementation of procedures, and then further, according to said procedures, to have a defined plan for each device or device family. So creating the procedure that details or dictates or provides a template for how you're going to put this plan in place and carry out this plan. Proactively can be further interpreted to basically say what you've been doing proactively can further be interpreted to basically say that what you've been doing in the past will no longer be sufficient. And as a note, actually what we've most likely all been doing in the past has never been sufficient if we really wanted to be complying with the med devs, but we won't go there again. Gone are the days when a manufacturer could point to their passive complaint and feedback system to address post-market surveillance requirements. So again, systematic, proactive. All right. There is a full section of a chapter dedicated to post-market surveillance in the EU MDR. It's Chapter 7, Section 1. Part of that chapter includes Article 83, which describes the responsibilities of the manufacturer related to post-market surveillance. So number 1, for each device, manufacturers shall plan, establish, document, and implement, i.e. systematic, and maintain and update a post-market surveillance system in a manner that is proportionate to the risk class and appropriate for the device type. Also, the post-market surveillance system shall be suited to actively and systematically gathering, recording, and analyzing data, and it's throughout its entire lifetime. So again, I've highlighted the critical words in red. System, proportionate to risk class and type of device, actively and systematically, and throughout the entire lifetime. I will touch on ways to incorporate risk class further in the presentation. We've already touched on the active and systematic approach to post-market surveillance. So lastly, lifetime. This is intended to highlight the requirement for considering performance and safety of the device throughout the claimed lifetime of the device based on its clinical application. So again, it's lifetime. We need to define that in technical documentation for obtaining a CE mark. Therefore, you should have an idea of what the lifetime of your device is, but this is also your manufacturing lifetime. So understanding really throughout the lifetime of that device, what the post-market surveillance requirements are. So at this point, I think you're starting to see the general intent of the requirements. You have an organizational requirement, you have an active role in maintaining the safety and performance of your device, and you need to consider it for the lifetime of the device. So as mentioned previously, many companies have performed some post-market surveillance activities. However, these have been very reactive, or in other words, not specifically planned for. Some common reactive approaches include complaint handling, non-conforming reports and other issues in manufacturing, service records if applicable to your device type, vigilance, literature reviews, and then looking at national regional registry reviews. So it's really just taking existing data and analyzing it. But what the new MDR is looking for is that the manufacturer is proactively collecting data on the device before a deficiency has occurred. So some proactive approaches are post-market clinical follow-up, again, registries and registry studies performed by the manufacturer, experience with similar devices, focus groups and customer surveys and user feedback. So here I'm introducing the term post-market clinical follow-up for the first time. We will touch on it a little later in the presentation, but in short, post-market surveillance requirements are outlined in Annex 14, Part B of the MDR, and as quoted from the MDR, shall be understood to be a continuous process that updates the clinical evaluation referred to in Article 61 and Part A of this annex, and shall be addressed in the manufacturer's post-market surveillance plan. When conducting post-market clinical follow-up, the manufacturer shall proactively collect and evaluate clinical data from the use in or on humans of a device which bears the CE marking and is placed on the market within its intended purpose as referred to in So I won't go through that right now, but basically it's a post-market activity, but the plan is required to be submitted as part of the clinical evaluation in your technical documentation, but it's driven by the post-market surveillance system. So it does, there is linkage between post-market clinical follow-up, post-market surveillance, your clinical evaluation, and your technical documentation in whole. Again, I'm going to try and illustrate the connection later on. So now that we've collected a whole lot of data, what are we going to do with that data? Article 83 actually gives you the expectations of what you do need to do with that data. Data gathered by the manufacturer's PMS system shall in particular be used to update the benefit risk determination and improve risk management, update any design and manufacturing information and labeling in general, update the clinical evaluation, update the summary of safety and clinical performance. It's also used to identify any needs for preventive or corrective or field safety corrective actions, identify any options to improve the device in usability, performance, and safety, when relevant, to contribute to the post-market surveillance of other devices, and then to detect and report trends, which in accordance with Article 88, which is a whole nother, which is really part of your post-market surveillance activities. So depending on the outcomes of your post-market surveillance, proactive and reactive data, or proactive and reactive data sources, technical documentation shall be updated accordingly, including, as we said, risk management, clinical evaluations, and any summaries of safety and clinical performance. So now we're starting to get an idea of how these new requirements will be incorporated into the quality management system. We're touching on, various risk design and manufacturing, labeling, CAPA system, and things like design controls. So we're starting to see how they can be incorporated in the quality management system and what processes may be interrelated. All right, so one of the new requirements of the MDR is to have a documented plan for each device or device family. Article 84 specifically states, the post-market surveillance system referred to in Article 83 shall be based on a post-market surveillance plan, the requirements for which are set out in Section 1.1 of Annex 3. And this plan is part of the technical documentation specified in Annex 2. So specific to that post-market surveillance, the MDR provides some guidelines as what is expected to appear and be considered in the post-market surveillance plan. So when you have your system in place, your quality management system in place, that dictates what should be part of the post-market surveillance plan, you're going to incorporate the Annex 3 information into maybe a template or something like that, so that you are covering the same, you're making sure that you cover the right requirements. So the post-market surveillance plan shall address how to collect and use particular available information. And the post-market surveillance plan should also cover processes, methods, acceptance criteria, etc. More specifically, Annex 3 states the following. So Annex 3 states the following. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but it shall address the collection and utilization of information, in particular information from serious incidents in the field, any records of non-serious incidents, trend reporting, literature, and other databases, registers, any feedback and complaints received, and then any publicly available information about similar devices, similar to what we touched on in our proactive data sources. Some of this data will be readily available, and then some will require an outline of how you're going to collect and analyze the data. And again, a very wordy slide, but it is important to understand because it has become so prescriptive in what is required that if you follow the MDR, you're going to understand what to put into your plan. So Annex 3 also provides guidance on how your post-market surveillance process needs to be performed. So although it shows it in the plan, I feel this also helps you to develop your post-market surveillance quality management system elements. So again, this plan is device specific. So even though our procedures will be written to give us an overall idea of how to perform this, each plan will be device specific. The post-market Annex 3 1.1b will just provide you a little bit more about what to consider for each plan. So it states specifically a proactive and systematic process to collect any information referred to in point A. For me, I would develop a process within my quality management system so that it's understood how we're going to collect that data. Also have effective and appropriate methods. Put this into your quality management system so that you're performing the same activities for each type of device. Suitable indicators and threshold values that shall be used in the continuous reassessment of the benefit risk analysis and of the risk management. This one is, again, understanding your device and the risk your device carries, so proportionate to the risk, as we touched on earlier, understanding what those thresholds can be that will need to either trigger an action or that's going to require some sort of change in your risk management and perhaps push the risk up higher or to decrease the risk, however you define that risk management, your risk matrix acceptability criteria. Then also have effective and appropriate methods and tools to investigate complaints and analyze market-related experience collected in the field. Again, if you have a good complaint and customer feedback process, you probably are doing this already. Also, methods and protocols to manage the events subject to the trend report. Again, this is one of my trending is something that I think is underutilized in many device companies, and there's much confusion between metrics and trending. So you do need to establish a good understanding of what your trends are related to whatever you're looking at for that particular device. So just to read this in a little bit more detail, it includes methods and protocols to be used to establish any statistically significant increase in the frequency or severity of incidents as well as the observation period. So it's really understanding when you are seeing a significant increase in issues with your particular device. It's going to be device specific. Also, methods and protocols to communicate effectively with competent authorities, notified bodies, economic operators, and users. The plan also needs to have an understanding of a reference to procedures to fulfill manufacturer obligations, systematic procedures to identify and initiate appropriate measures, effective tools to trace and identify devices for which corrective actions might be necessary, and then your post-market clinical follow-up plan. So although this is establishing for you what is required in that plan, there's no issue with referencing existing procedures and existing methods on how these are managed within your organization. But if they do not exist or specific to a device, you do need to have them specifically in your post-market surveillance plan. All right, so now that we've established the requirements of what the plan is and therefore what the activities related to post-market surveillance are, there are requirements around what reports will be required for each device. So there are two types of reports required under the new MDR, depending on the device classification. The post-market surveillance report is intended for low-risk Class 1 devices and it needs to summarize the results and conclusions of the post-market data, along with a rationale and a description of any corrective actions taken for products on the market. This will be included with your technical documentation. It just needs to be updated when necessary, and it needs to be made available on request. So again, it doesn't, having a class 1 device does not take away the requirement for performing post-market surveillance. However, in your plan, you can reduce the effort and burden based on that risk, so proportionate to the risk. And you're not required to report this to provide the report to the competent authorities, but you do need to have a somewhat simple report covering your analysis and any conclusions based off the analysis, as well as any actions taken. And those just need to be available on request. And unfortunately, this is another wordy page, but for any higher risk devices, so anything that's not class 1, you need to provide what's called a periodic safety update report. So these are intended for higher risk devices. I'm not going to go through this in detail because it's pretty I think it's pretty straightforward. But basically, the periodic safety update report summarizes the results and conclusions of the PMS data, similar to the post-market surveillance report. There needs to be additional information on other post-market information, vigilance reporting, and the current status of these devices on the market. There needs to be a rationale and description of any corrective actions taken for products on the market. And the contents for this are described in Article 86, as we have on the slide. So it's for anything that's not class 1, class 2A, class 2B, and class 3 devices, of which your implants will fall into one of those, class 2Bs or class 3. Periodic safety update report, it's required for each device, and where relevant for each category or group of devices. You need to summarize the results and conclusions of the analysis, and you need to, again, throughout the lifetime of the device, so this is going to be an ongoing requirement, and it shall include the following: conclusions of benefit risk determination, as we've touched on before. You're going to need to have thresholds and understandings of what may trigger changes in your risk management, and therefore changes in any type of benefit risk determination. The main findings of any post-market clinical follow-up studies that have been performed. Even if they're not complete, you can summarize any main findings that have occurred up to now. Volume of sales of the device and estimate evaluation of the size and other characteristics of the population. And then usage frequency of device and things like that. The rest I'll touch on in a little bit. So give me 1 second here. All right, yeah, here we go. So summary of report timelines. As I mentioned earlier, the post-market surveillance report for class 1 devices, it just needs to be updated as necessary and made available to the notified body, the competent authority on request. Class 2A is the periodic safety update report. It's required throughout the lifetime of the device, and it's updated as necessary, but at least every 2 years. This needs to be made available to the notified body, as well as made available to the competent authority. So slight increase in requirements, slight increase in the contents of the report, but only every 2 years at least, and just made available. So again, yeah, made available. Class 2Bs, class 3s, and implantables, again, the periodic safety update report required to be updated annually. So really, it triggers your post-market surveillance activities to be performed at least on an annual basis. However, I would always recommend it to be done throughout that year. They are required, class 3s and implantables are required to be submitted electronically to the notified body. And they just also need to be made available to the competent authorities. So as shown here, let me just go back one. Class 3 devices and implantables, you need to submit these devices. Class 2As, you just need to it needs to be part of your technical documentation. So not everything is required to be submitted to the notified bodies except class 3s and implantables. All right, one of my favorite and least favorite topics all at the same time, trend reporting. So as you can see now, they have actually included part of the regulation to describe the trend reporting that is required. So the final article, this is the final article discussing any post-market surveillance requirements within that Chapter 7, Article 88. Manufacturers shall report by means of the electronic system referred to in Article 92 any statistically significant increase in the frequency or severity of incidents. So these are not going to be serious incidents. So these are not things that may have triggered some sort of vigilance reporting, but they're something that could be considered not a serious incident, or that not expected to have an undesirable side effect, but could have a significant impact on the benefit risk analysis. So again, it's even though you're taking into account any of the sort of reported actions like the vigilance reports and things like that, these are for ones that may not require that, but are still may have an impact on the benefit risk analysis. So Section 1 and 5 of Annex 2, see my notes here. All right, so you need to focus on the significant increase. So you need to have a procedure in place that describes how you're going to statistically analyze this data. Again, it's been part of sort of complaint handling and adverse event reporting in a lot of the quality management systems that I've worked with. So this is just making sure that how you're analyzing this and how you're expected to use this in your post-market surveillance plan is well laid out. So the manufacturer shall specify how to manage the incidents referred to in the first subparagraph and the methodology used for determining any statistically significant increase in the frequency or severity. So again, it's just how to put it into your quality management system, and then having someone with knowledge of statistics to ensure that how you're analyzing it, how you're collecting it, maybe how you're grouping the data has meaning and can be used. Okay, so I've spoken a lot about the requirements of post-market surveillance in the from the EU MDR. So now I'm just going to touch a little bit on, well, how do you integrate this into your quality management system? I've tried to include that as I've been going along so that you can have that understanding, but I'm going to really touch on it now or go into a little bit more detail. So knowing what the requirements are, like we're just going to talk about how to incorporate them. Article 10 states the general obligations on the manufacturers. So the quality management system shall address at least the following aspects: setting up, implementation, and maintenance of a post-market surveillance system. So how to do that, I'm just going to go over, and this is where I'm trying to bring in some of the linkages of everything I've touched on and how to bring it into your quality management system. It does not need to be complicated. One thing, it really is not complicated. One of the best ways for me to, when I first started out doing this and to visualize it, is to create a process interaction flowchart, which I have on the following slide. So again, very simple. It doesn't have to be complicated, and there's many, many ways of doing this. And this is again from the quality management systems side. It's not just risk management, PMS, and clinical evaluation. This is just how to incorporate it and the requirements. Just an idea, not going to go through this one in detail. But basically, a process interaction flowchart and linkages to the following. So design and development. Where are you going to take, where post-market surveillance information may be relevant for products in development. So few aspects here. Understanding how to feed post-market surveillance into your design controls for products that are under development, or even when you're doing post-market surveillance activities, how to take that information and make updates or modifications for your device to improve safety and performance. Of course, feedback and complaint handling. This is really a source of data. So how do you pull the information? How do you trend the information you may have in your complaint handling into your post-market surveillance activity? So this will be a source for your activities. Same with field actions, recalls, and safety notices. Management review. This is really taking the data that you have, perhaps your post-market surveillance report or the periodic safety update report, taking that data and feeding it back to management to make sure that they understand what's happening with the device on the market. Of course, risk management. So analyzing that data and making sure that benefit risk determinations updated, any risk management, other risk management documentation is updated as required. Of course, technical documentation, any changes you make to most of this will need to be fed back into your technical documentation. Labeling, same as design and development. Are there any updates that need to occur as a result of an increased risk, a new warning, anything like that? Clinical evaluation. So clinical evaluation is required to be performed as a pre-market activity and then needs to be updated periodically throughout the lifetime of your device. Now, clinical evaluation is going to, the data that you obtain from the initial clinical evaluation, as well as any post-market clinical follow-up studies that are done, are going to feed into your post-market surveillance. It is in somewhat a source of your post-market surveillance data, but also if you did, when you're doing literature studies and things on other current similar devices, you may want to take some post-market surveillance data and evaluate that in your clinical evaluation. So it's a two-way system there. Corrective and preventive actions, basically any actions you may have taken as a result of your post-market surveillance data. Periodic safety update reports. Again, this is just within your post-market surveillance system. Write that in so that you have a template. I've really liked the development of templates for the plans and the reports so that you're doing the same thing over and over again for your devices. So just develop a post-market surveillance system and then have that in there. Summary of safety and clinical performance, same thing, is just have that, know what data you need to pull out from your post-market surveillance, from your clinical evaluation, post-market clinical follow-up into your summary. And then, of course, what is the format and what type of regulatory communication is required. So those are really, for me, what I believe are the elements where you need to bring post-market surveillance into your quality management system to meet the EU MDR requirements. So once you've determined those interactions and once you've looked through this, take each of those procedures and revise it to ensure that you're taking into consideration the requirements of the regulation and any of the med devs that still exist. Ensure the linkages are clear and there's a strategy on how the post-market surveillance implementation is performed. So again, these are your procedures. I'm just giving you ideas on how I have gone about doing this, but these are your procedures and they need to describe the requirements of your planning and implementation and really do it so that it makes sense for your company, your organizational structure, whether it's responsibilities of departments. I know that can be an issue sometimes, whether it's one person who is the main focus post-market surveillance or whether it's just data collected by others and fed into one. Make sure that it works for your organizational plans and post-market clinical follow-up plans, meaning your procedures will tell you how to do it. Your plans for post-market clinical follow-up and for post-market surveillance need to be specific to a device, so it's not a general. All right, so that's how I integrate it into the quality management system. I think I need to be wrapping up here for our Q&A very shortly. So I think we have 10 minutes left, so let me get moving here. I still have a little bit more to go through, but I may actually just skip the impact to the business, but those will be available on these slides. So just to touch on the risk. A post-market surveillance system needs to be developed in a manner that's proportionate to the risk class and appropriate for the type of device. I touched on that earlier, but things to consider when proportionate risk: history of clinical performance of the device, its intended use, and the maturity stage of the device. This can, even though maybe high risk in the beginning, as you gain data, you may be able to reduce the requirements around it because you have the clinical evidence to, you don't need to have as much detail necessarily. These are just things to consider. Not going to, unfortunately, running out of time here. Too much to say on this topic. I'm going to skip through skip through the impact to the business, but those again will be in those slides. It may be important for management, so do take a read of it. It could be justification for requirements around resources and the increase in resources required to perform post-market surveillance activities initially and as an ongoing activity. So definitely something that you want to touch on. Here I've included a resource requirements to show the type of personnel and departments involved in collecting post-market surveillance data. All right. And then just to quickly touch on this, because I do think it's important, is the relationship between post-market surveillance, risk management, and clinical evaluation. I did touch on it a second ago, but basically risk management feeds into post-market surveillance and clinical evaluation. Clinical evaluation feeds into risk management and post-market surveillance. And post-market surveillance feeds into clinical evaluation and clinical evaluation risk management. So as you can see, I've made it as simple as possible that there is really a complete interrelationship between all of them. So you need to take that into consideration. It was kind of a little bit of a joke because it makes it completely not clear, but that's what it is. Feeds into each other in like a circular form. So Jessica, how much longer I think we've only got, how much longer do we have for questions? Only 4 minutes. So I'm not sure whether I should carry on talking or just take 5 minutes of Q&A at this point. Unfortunately, I haven't got through everything. It's really to do with risk management, a little bit of risk management and clinical evaluation. That's more related to MDR in general and how the interrelationship works. But I have at least touched on what are the requirements for post-market surveillance as it stands and how they are interrelated. So I can stop now, and the rest of the slides will be available for everybody. But I'd rather take the Q&A right now, actually, just in case there's some questions that I need to answer.
I think that's a great idea. So yeah, the handout, there is plenty of the information from the slides there. Don't forget, Carolyn will answer any questions that she's not able to get to. One of the biggest questions that has been coming through, I've seen it in a couple of different ways, is that you mentioned that the PMS plans must be device specific. Can that be a family of devices? So like if I have like different sizes, can I use it the same one for them? Or if we're saying that a device is a system and it's comprised of 5 or 6 different things, do I have to have 5 or 6 different PMS plans or one, like surgical tools, instrumentation, all of those?
Sure. So I think what understanding needs to be is what is the reason for post-market surveillance is to understand the performance of the device on the market, to understand safety and performance. So it's not required to have for each device type in a system, specifically if they all work together as a system, but really as long as you can gather data that will provide feedback or provide information that can be analyzed for different parts of the system, do it as one. It's really getting an understanding of what you're trying to accomplish in your post-market surveillance. So if you're writing for a device family, I would create some sort of overview to show that this family, everything that you put into this family the data can be gathered with that one plan. So you already want to provide the evidence of that family and why they are considered, I don't want to say equivalent, but why you feel you can group that as a family. And if not, it may need to be device specific.
Awesome. This is a combination question. So who is responsible for writing the PSUR, PMSR, and will that information be available to the public?
So who is responsible is completely up to your organization. I would say the actual writing and submitting most likely falls into the regulatory. However, inputs into post-market surveillance, and I can't make this clear enough, is not only a regulatory responsibility. Information needs to be, data needs to be coming from all parts of the organization. But yes, it may feed into one person who ends up writing the report and submitting it if it is a report that needs to be submitted. These will not be publicly available. That would be nice, but they are not going to be publicly available. What will be publicly available is that summary, the summary of clinical safety and performance.
Awesome. So does this mean that we have to do clinical studies annually once the device is on the market?
So nothing requires you, well, that's not true. Post-market clinical follow-up studies, it really depends on the data that you have for your device, historic data. So if you've had something on the market for a long time, it depends on what data you have available. If there is a study that is required to maybe outline some sort of performance claim or something like that, yeah, you may need to, or to confirm it if it's not been used in humans before, to a brand new device, you may need evidence you may need the evidence. But again, clinical evaluation is required periodically. Post-market clinical follow-up it depends on your company and the device and the market and the population and the risk. It really depends. But it is a requirement to have a plan around it if you are performing it, or good justification as to why none is required. Clinical evaluation is required periodically, though. It is a requirement, but that is not, clinical evaluation and clinical studies are two different things.
Okay, thank you guys for all of these fantastic questions. Carolyn, we have lots and lots and lots of questions that unfortunately we are out of time, not going to be able to address. Now, the good news is that all of these questions that Carolyn will get them, she will be able to follow up with you guys in terms of being able to get them addressed and answered. In terms of, there's a recording of this, and there are in the handouts section, you can get a copy of the slides right now if you would like those. Don't forget that there are other sessions going on. This is day 2, so there is tomorrow still for additional sessions, more for the virtual summit. And again, this is being recorded, so you guys will be able to have access to this, and Carolyn will be following up for all of these. Don't forget, the next session is starting in a little bit less than 10 minutes. If you haven't yet registered, you're more than welcome to register for that session to attend. Thank you guys, and thank you, Carolyn. This has been a fantastic presentation.
No problem. Well, thank you everyone for attending. It's been my pleasure.